Judge Thomas Mercer sat alone in his chambers, the weight of the document before him pressing down like a physical burden. Outside, the streets of Oakwood, Virginia hummed with the usual activity of a spring afternoon in 1866. The war had been over for a year, but in the small town 50 miles west of Richmond, the wounds remained raw. The changes brought by defeat still bitter medicine for many. At 53, Thomas had served as circuit judge for nearly 15 years. He had been a reluctant supporter of the Confederacy, not out of deep conviction, but from the practical reality of his position and community. Now, in the uncertain times of early Reconstruction, he found himself walking an increasingly precarious line between the old order and the new. The document that troubled him was a bill of sale. It described, in the cold, transactional language of commerce, the purchase of a Negro girl, aged approximately 12 years, named Lily, of sound body and obedient disposition. The buyer was Harold Winters, Oakwood's mayor and one of its wealthiest citizens. The date of purchase, April 2, 1865, just 1 week before Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Thomas removed his spectacles and pinched the bridge of his nose. The legal issue was complicated. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 had not applied to Virginia areas already under Union control. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery had been passed by Congress in January 1865, but wasn't ratified until December that year. After this sale, in the chaos of the war's end, many enslaved people had simply walked away from plantations, while others remained, uncertain of their status or options. What made this case particularly troubling was the girl's age and the timing of the sale. Mayor Winters clearly knew the Confederacy was collapsing when he made the purchase. And now, a year later, he was still claiming ownership of the child, keeping her as a house servant under conditions that, according to the whisper reports that had reached Thomas, differed little from slavery. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His clerk, a thin young man named James, entered with concerned expression. "Judge Mercer, Mayor Winters is here to see you. He says it's urgent." Thomas quickly folded the document and slipped it into his desk drawer. "Send him in, James." Harold Winters filled the doorway with a substantial presence. At 60, he maintained the commanding bearing that had made him a successful businessman and politician. His gray hair was impeccably groomed, his suit expensive despite the economic hardships affecting most of the South. "Thomas," he said without preamble, "I understand someone has brought a complaint against me regarding my household arrangements. If this story of quiet bravery is inspiring you, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to No Filter America. Your support helps us share more true stories about justice, resistance, and the courage to do what's right, even in secret." Night had fallen by the time Thomas finally left his chambers. His conversation with Mayor Winters had been tense, but outwardly cordial, a dance of implications and veiled threats beneath a veneer of gentlemanly discourse. The mayor had made it clear that any formal questioning of his property rights would be met with significant resistance, both legal and political. "We're trying to rebuild our town, our way of life," Winters had said, his voice reasonable but his eyes cold. "These northern ideas about suddenly giving full rights to people who aren't prepared for them, it will destroy everything we've worked for. Surely you can see that, Thomas." Thomas had remained noncommittal, promising only to review the relevant laws carefully. This had seemed to satisfy Winters, at least temporarily. But as Thomas walked the darkening streets toward his home, the mayor's parting words echoed in his mind. "Remember who your friends are, Judge. These are unstable times. A man needs allies he can trust." Instead of turning toward his comfortable house on Elm Street, Thomas found himself walking toward the modest office of William Foster, a young lawyer who had served in the Union Army and moved to Oakwood after the war. Foster had been the one to bring Lily's situation to his attention, carefully gathering evidence and statements from freedmen who worked in or near the Winters household. The office was dark when he arrived, but a light shone from the small apartment above. Thomas knocked on the side door, and moments later Foster appeared, surprise evident on his face. "Judge Mercer, is everything all right? I need to speak with you, Mr. Foster. Privately." Upstairs, in the sparsely furnished rooms that served as both home and secondary office for the young lawyer, Thomas shared the details of his meeting with Winters. He knows someone has raised questions, Thomas concluded. He doesn't know it was you, specifically, but he will soon enough if this proceeds officially. Foster leaned forward, his expression earnest. At 30, he still carried himself with the alertness of a soldier. Judge, that girl is being held illegally. The 13th Amendment was ratified after her purchase. Thomas interrupted. Legally, it's a gray area at best. Winters has enough influence to tie this up in courts for years. So you're saying nothing can be done? Foster's disappointment was palpable. Thomas stared out the window at the quiet street below. I didn't say that. He turned back to the younger man. Tell me, do you still have connections with the Freedmen's Bureau in Richmond? Foster nodded slowly. Yes, I correspond regularly with their legal department. And those former slaves who gave statements about the girl's situation, can they be trusted to keep quiet if necessary? Absolutely. They risked much to speak up at all. Thomas made his decision. Here's what we're going to do. Chapter 3. Under cover of darkness, the moon was a slim crescent, providing just enough light for Thomas to make out the path without stumbling. It was nearly midnight, and the streets of Oakwood were deserted except for the occasional stray dog. He moved quietly, staying close to the buildings, his dark coat helping him blend into shadows. William Foster walked several paces ahead, leading the way toward the rear of Mayor Winters' grand house on the hill overlooking the town. They had timed their approach carefully, knowing that Winters would be attending a meeting of the town's business association until late, leaving only his wife and servants at home. Behind them walked Samuel Johnson, a former slave who now worked as Foster's assistant. Samuel had once been a house servant at a neighboring estate and knew the routines of wealthy households intimately. More importantly, his cousin worked in the Winters kitchen and had provided crucial information about the layout of the house and the location of the small attic room where Lily slept. This is far enough, Judge, Foster whispered as they reached the edge of the property. Samuel and I will go the rest of the way. Less risk if you're not directly involved. Thomas nodded, but found himself reluctant to stay behind. I'm already involved, he said firmly, and if we're caught, my presence might provide some protection. Let's proceed. They approached from the rear of the property, where large oak trees provided additional cover. A small door led to the kitchen, which Samuel's cousin had promised to leave unlocked. Inside, the house was quiet and dark, with only the faint glow of embers in the kitchen fireplace providing any illumination. Samuel led them confidently through the kitchen and up a narrow servant staircase to the second floor, then to an even narrower set of steps that accessed the attic. At the top, a small door was secured with a simple latch. Foster opened it slowly, wincing at the slight creak of the hinges. Inside, a tiny room with a single window held a small cot, a washstand, and little else. On the cot, a girl lay sleeping, her thin frame barely making an outline under the worn blanket. Samuel approached her gently, placing a hand over her mouth as he woke her to prevent any startled cry. Her eyes flew open, wide with fear, until Samuel whispered to her, Lily, we've come to take you out of here, to freedom, but you must be absolutely quiet. Do you understand? The girl nodded, her eyes now darting between the three men. Samuel removed his hand, and she sat up, revealing a face that showed both the innocence of childhood and the wariness that came from hard experience. Are you really taking me away? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas stepped forward, kneeling to meet her at eye level. Yes, he said gently. You're free, Lily. You have been since the war ended. What Mayor Winters did, keeping you here, it was wrong, illegal. We're going to make sure you're safe now. Lily needed no further convincing. She quickly gathered her. Few possessions, a small rag doll, an extra dress, a worn Bible, and wrapped them in a shawl. Within minutes, they were retracing their steps through the silent house. As they reached the kitchen, a floorboard creaked overhead. They froze, listening intently. Footsteps moved across the floor above them, then stopped. Mrs. Winters, Samuel mouthed silently. They waited, barely breathing, until the footsteps resumed and then faded, apparently returning to the bedroom. Only then did they slip out the kitchen door and into the night, A wagon waited for them at the edge of town, driven by another freedman who nodded respectfully to Judge Mercer but asked no questions. The plan was simple but effective. Lily would be taken to Richmond to the offices of the Freedmen's Bureau, where she would be officially documented as a free person and placed with a family of former slaves who had established themselves as shopkeepers in the city. As the wagon prepared to depart, Thomas handed Foster an envelope. Legal documents, he explained. Proof that Lily's purchase occurred under circumstances that render it null and void, and a judicial order signed by me confirming her freedom. It was a legal stretch, but Thomas had spent hours crafting language that might withstand challenge. Foster took the envelope, understanding the risk the judge was taking. This won't stay secret for long, he warned. By tomorrow, Winters will know she's gone. By the next day, he'll suspect your involvement. Thomas nodded grimly. I know, but sometimes a man must choose between what is legal and what is right. He turned to Lily, who sat huddled in the wagon, still looking bewildered by the sudden turn of events. You're going to be all right now, child. Remember that you were born to be free, and no one can ever take that from you again. As the wagon pulled away, disappearing into the darkness, Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders despite the certain knowledge that he had just set in motion events that would upend his carefully constructed life. Whatever consequences came, he had done the right thing. For once, that seemed enough. Chapter 4. The morning after Thomas awoke at dawn after a restless night. Through his window, he witnessed Mayor Winters galloping through town with several men, fury evident on his face. It's begun, Thomas murmured. At Foster's office, the lawyer confirmed Lily had safely reached Richmond and was registered with the Freedmen's Bureau. Winters was already searching the town and questioning servants. Has my name been mentioned? Thomas asked. Not explicitly, but rumors are spreading, Foster replied. At the courthouse, tensions were palpable. Black townspeople watched proceedings with intense interest, while white citizens gathered in concerned groups. Mayor Winters burst into Thomas's chambers. She's gone, he fumed. Stolen in the night. I've heard the rumors, Thomas replied calmly. It's theft of property, Winters insisted. People cannot be property anymore, Harold. Thomas said firmly. The 13th Amendment is clear. Winters' face flushed with anger. You self-righteous hypocrite. You owned slaves yourself until 63. Yes, and that fact shames me daily. Unlike you, I've accepted that the world has changed. You've made a serious mistake, Winters warned. I've sent riders to Petersburg. The authorities will help recover my property, and everyone involved will face consequences. Chapter 5. Word spreads by midday. Oakwood hummed with tension. Thomas's clerk, James, whispered news during court recess. Foster's been meeting with freedmen leaders all morning. They're gathering at the African Methodist Church. James added more worrisome information. There's talk that Mayor Winters plans to authorize a militia action to retrieve the girl and make an example of those who helped her. After court, Samuel Johnson delivered a note from Foster. Winters has called for 20 armed men to ride to Richmond tomorrow. Claims to have papers from Petersburg authorizing Lily's return. Freedmen community preparing response. That evening, Thomas met Foster at his office, along with 3 freedmen leaders, Reverend Turner, Carpenter Benjamin Morris, and teacher Frederick Washington. Winters has recruited former Confederate officers for a recovery party, Morris explained. They plan to ride to Richmond tomorrow. Our people are frightened, Washington added. They fear this is the beginning of an attempt to reverse our freedom. What are you planning? Thomas asked. Freedmen from neighboring communities have been arriving since midday, Reverend Turner replied. By tomorrow morning, we expect several hundred to have gathered. A confrontation could turn deadly, Thomas warned, which is why we need your help, Washington urged. As a judge, your public declaration that the girl was held illegally would strengthen our position. Thomas considered the request. If I do this, I'll be effectively ending my career in this town, possibly risking my life. We're all taking risks, Reverend Turner said quietly, but some principles are worth the cost. Chapter 6. The gathering storm dawn broke over Oakwood. Thomas had spent the night drafting a formal judicial opinion declaring Lily's freedom under the 13th Amendment and condemning any attempt to reclaim her as property. Foster met him at the courthouse with news. Winters and his men are gathering at his estate, planning to ride out at noon. Over 500 freedmen have assembled overnight. They plan to block the road from Winters' estate. Suddenly, James bursts in. "Judge Mercer, there's a federal officer here." In the courtroom stood Captain Andrew Miller with 2 Union soldiers. "I've been dispatched by General Williams to address the situation. The Freedmen's Bureau in Richmond contacted us about armed men preparing to recapture a freed child. How many troops have you brought?" Thomas asked. "Just 8 men. Reinforcements will follow if necessary." Outside, a commotion drew their attention. Through the window, they saw Reverend Turner leading freedmen toward the courthouse, with a much larger group gathered at the edge of town. "Those aren't just local people," Foster observed. "I recognize faces from communities 20 miles away." Captain Miller reviewed Thomas's judicial opinion. "Impressive legal reasoning. I suggest we proceed immediately to Winters' estate to prevent his group from riding out." As they prepared to leave, Reverend Turner entered with alarming news. Armed men have been seen on the outskirts of town. "Not Winters' group. These are strangers. Hired guns from Petersburg, perhaps?" Thomas suggested. Captain Miller addressed the Reverend. "I understand your people are blocking the road, but I must advise against any action that could lead to violence." Reverend Turner stood firm. "This isn't just about one child anymore. It's about whether the new laws will be enforced or ignored at the whim of men like Winters. We're counting on you, Judge, to stand with us." As they left together, the judge, lawyer, military officer, and minister, Thomas knew the confrontation ahead would test the nation's commitment to its newly affirmed principles of freedom. Chapter 7. The confrontation the road to Mayor Winters' estate wound through rolling hills on the outskirts of Oakwood. As Thomas, Foster, and Captain Miller approached on horseback, an extraordinary sight came into view. Hundreds of freedmen and women stood shoulder to shoulder across the road, creating a human barrier. They were unarmed but resolute, their faces showing determination born from generations of suffering and newfound hope. At the front of the gathering stood Reverend Turner, alongside other community leaders. Behind them, men, women, and even children had formed orderly rows stretching across the road and into the fields on either side. "My God," Foster whispered, "there must be 500 people here." More. Captain Miller assessed with a soldier's eye. Closer to 700. Thomas dismounted, overwhelmed by the scale of the response. An elderly woman approached him, her back bent from years of field labor, but her eyes clear and direct. "You the judge who saved that child?" she asked simply. "I helped," Thomas acknowledged. She nodded once. "Then we stand for you today." From the direction of the estate came the sound of hoofbeats. Mayor Winters appeared at the head of his group. 30 men on horseback, all armed with pistols or rifles. They pulled up short at the sight of the massive gathering blocking their path. Captain Miller urged his horse forward, positioning himself between the two groups. "Mayor Winters," he called, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "I am Captain Andrew Miller of the United States Army. I order you to disband this unauthorized militia immediately." Winters' face darkened with anger. "This is a local matter, Captain. These men are acting under my authority as mayor to retrieve stolen property." "There is no stolen property," Thomas stated firmly, stepping forward with his judicial opinion in hand. "I have ruled officially that the child Lily was held illegally under the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. She is a free person, not property." "You have no right," Winters began. "He has every right." Came a new voice. A rider approached from the direction of town, a distinguished-looking man in the uniform of a Union general, accompanied by a dozen soldiers. "General Williams," Captain Miller saluted. "Captain." The general nodded acknowledgement before addressing the gathering. "I am General James Williams, commander of federal forces in this district. I received reports of an illegal militia forming with intent to violate the rights of a freed person." His gaze fixed on Winters. "Such actions constitute rebellion against the lawful government of the United States." Chapter 8. Justice prevails. What followed was a tense standoff that would be recounted in Oakwood for generations. Mayor Winters, suddenly facing not just freedmen but federal military authority, attempted to argue that local sovereignty gave him the right to determine Lily's status. General Williams dismounted and spoke loudly enough for all to hear. The war settled that question, sir. Federal law is supreme, and the 13th Amendment is clear. No person shall be held in slavery or involuntary servitude within the United States. From the crowd, Frederick Washington stepped forward. Mayor Winters, we have endured much in silence, but the time for silence is over. These people, he gestured to hundreds gathered, have come not just for one child, but for the promise America made to all of us. Freedom cannot be partial or conditional. Winters looked around, his confidence visibly faltering as he realized the extent of his miscalculation. His men shifted uncomfortably, many clearly reluctant to challenge federal troops. Thomas seized the moment, reading his judicial opinion aloud. His voice strengthened as he spoke, carrying across the hushed crowd. Therefore, I rule that the attempt to claim ownership of the child Lily constitutes a violation of the 13th Amendment. Any papers purporting to authorize her return to servitude are null and void. She is by law and by right a free citizen. A murmur ran through the freedmen, swelling into expressions of approval. General Williams nodded his agreement. Mayor Winters, the general said, you have a choice. Disband your men peacefully, or face arrest for insurrection. For a moment, it seemed Winters might resist. Then, from among his own group, a voice called out, Harold, it's over. It was Jonathan Mills, a prominent local businessman. The war is lost. Slavery is ended. We must accept it and move forward. One by one, Winters supporters lowered their weapons. Some turned their horses and rode away. Finally, left with only a handful of diehards, Winters himself conceded defeat. This isn't finished, he warned Thomas. The South won't forget. Perhaps not, Thomas replied, but it must change nonetheless. Chapter 9. A new beginning. 1 week later, Thomas Mercer sat in his office, packing the personal items from his desk. As expected, his position had become untenable in Oakwood. The town council, still dominated by men like Winters, had called for his resignation. Rather than fight, Thomas had chosen to step down. A knock at the door revealed William Foster. Your carriage is ready, Judge. Not Judge anymore, Thomas reminded him with a small smile. Foster leaned against the doorframe. Have you decided where you'll go? Richmond, for now. The federal authorities have offered me a position with the Reconstruction Administration. It seems my judicial opinion on Lily's case impressed some important people. And Lily? Have you heard anything? Thomas nodded. She settled with a family of teachers, already learning to read, apparently. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Thomas was surprised to find a crowd gathered on the steps. Not angry townspeople, but freedmen and women. Reverend Turner stood at their center. We couldn't let you leave without saying goodbye, the Reverend explained. And thank you. One by one, people stepped forward to shake Thomas's hand or offer simple words of gratitude. Some he recognized from the confrontation on the road. Others were strangers to him, but had clearly been touched by his stand. Benjamin Morris presented him with a small, beautifully crafted wooden box. A gift from our community, he said, to remember what happened here. Inside was a silver watch engraved with a simple inscription, for justice when it mattered most. Thomas was moved beyond words. He had expected to leave Oakwood in disgrace. Instead, he found himself honored by those whose opinion he now realized mattered most to him. What you did for Lily, Reverend Turner said quietly, you did for all of us. You helped prove that the words of freedom written in Washington can have meaning in places like Oakwood. As Thomas's carriage pulled away, he looked back at the gathered crowd, black faces raised in farewell, hands waving goodbye to a man who had risked everything to do what was right. Among them stood Foster, who had chosen to remain in Oakwood to continue the legal fight for freedmen's rights. Thomas reflected on how a single decision to help one child had altered the course of so many lives, including his own. The road ahead would not be easy. Reconstruction was fraught with challenges, backlash, and resistance. But something fundamental had shifted, not just in the law, but in the hearts of people like himself who had been silent too long. 2 months later, Thomas returned briefly to Oakwood to testify in a federal case against a hired gunman from Petersburg, who had been arrested before they could interfere in the confrontation. As he left the temporary courtroom, he passed Mayor Winters on the street. The two men locked eyes briefly, a wordless acknowledgement of the new reality that had taken hold. That evening, Thomas visited the African Methodist Church, where a small school had been established. There, pinned to the wall alongside the alphabet in simple arithmetic tables, was a framed copy of his judicial opinion in Lily's case. Children, black children who would grow up never knowing the chains their parents had worn, were learning to read using the words he had written about freedom and dignity. It was, Thomas decided, the finest legacy a judge could hope for. And now we'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think made 500 freedmen rise up the very next day? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget, like this video, subscribe to No Filter America, and help us keep stories of strength and dignity alive.